Hello, everyone. Today we are hopefully, maybe we do more than just the activity source API, but based on past experience, we might actually need the full hour for this. So we'll see. Tarek, do you want to give us an overview of what it is?
Yeah, can you share the
Oh,
screen?
yeah, like there's that. I keep forgetting this. I only share my screen with the internet, it seems. I'm not sharing it with my friends. Here we go.
Yeah, go a little bit down for the proposal itself. So basically in 5, we have introduced the activity context, which is contains the context of the tracing, like trace ID, span ID, and flags, and some states. And this activity context, its purpose, it can be in the distributed tracing scenarios. It can be transferred over the wire, and when it get transferred over the wire, I mean it will get serialized in some two fields. So one of them is called like the tracing parent tracing or something like this, which is get formatted to some specific string, and the second field is just the states. So the issue here is like if somebody, I mean like in other end is reading these two fields from the headers, like HTTP headers, I mean getting the context, they want to convert these two fields back to the activity context object. So they need to parse it back and create the activity context object from it, which is like, it's not that complicated, but still about like, we don't expect everyone need to do that, who is going to parse the fields themselves and create the activity context from it. So the proposal here is just like getting what we call it like the W3C ID, which has the formatted trace ID, span ID, and flags, and the trace state, and from these two, and we create the activity context from it. We thought, I mean, like the proposal here is just like to follow the pattern for try parse. We thought about like to have the constructor, but the point is if we got malformed IDs, I mean, we are going to throw and the calling pattern will be not that. I mean, like, so people need to do try catch around it. So we prefer just to go with the try parse pattern, which is can take the W3C ID and the trace state and just return the context from it.
Sorry, maybe you already mentioned it. What is the trace state?
Trace state is just like property and the value. I mean, like in the context of the tracing itself, you can add like some properties with some values. So, and this is get formatted like property name equal value, comma, property name 2 equal value 2, and so on. And all of this are concatenated in just one string.
So there is some specific format to it, correct?
Yeah, when it get transferred, but for us, I mean, like we carry it as just a string. We don't care about like the actual format ourselves.
Yeah, I'm looking through the type right now. The activity context public constructor already takes a string trace state and doesn't do any type of validation on it. It just, like Tarek says, treats it as an opaque string. So try parse here presumably should do the same.
Yes. Yeah,
And
the only try parse, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the only try parse, I mean, like the W3CID, this is the one which is we need to parse it because this is constructed as like 2 digits version dash and trace ID, which is 32 digits, hexadigits and dash, and then 16 hexadigits for span ID and dash some flags. So this is the one which is like needs some parsing. I mean, like as I mentioned about like it's not that difficult, but it's not also easy. I mean, like we don't expect everyone to do this parsing by themselves.
Yeah. So also, the second question I have is, haven't we decided that we would use spans of char for try parse methods, such that people can parse subsections of a larger string? Is it important here? Should we do it?
To do it as a span instead of strings?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like usually while people reading I think the HTTP header and this stuff, which has the IDs, it will be strings anyway. But if we are passing span, so for the state at least we are going to convert it to string again because we need to store it as a string.
Well, that's true for the trace state, right? But like the W3 CID, I think is the thing you're actually parsing, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like we can have it like read only span for that, but yeah.
Tara, can you clarify something you just said? It looks like as an implementation, this is calling into activity trace ID and a few other types. Do those types rehydrate a string from a read-only span of char?
No.
Okay, so there's no, it sounds like there's no scenario and never will be a scenario for the remainder of the universe where calling a span-taking API will rehydrate a string.
No.
If calling this span-consuming API will rehydrate a string, because remember, as soon as this API takes a span, we're basically forbidden from rehydrating a string from that span, from anything that this method might call, because otherwise we're now violating the no allocation contract.
I mean, where does the W3 CID go? Is it basically becoming the activity trace ID or the activity span ID?
No, I mean, it will get parsed and split into 3 parts. One is called trace ID, which is we store it as activity trace ID type. And the second is trace, the second is span ID, which is get also split into parsed to the type is called activity span ID. And the third one is just a flag, which is it's a number about like it's a binary number. I mean, like either 0 or 1.
So so they're both structs, and it seems like they don't have public constructors. So like, how do you construct them? Basically, do they hold on to bytes, or like how do they?
How we constructed?
Yeah, what does the activity trace ID actually represent?
Yeah, it just represent. Okay, so activity trace ID, for example, is just a struct around string, so it will be constructed as string at the end.
Okay, so that basically means if we would take a span, you would have to copy to construct that other.
Yeah, either taking a string or a span, we have to split it anyway. I mean, like.
So you would have to allocate regardless.
It will not make any difference. I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was hinting at earlier with if we're just going to rehydrate a string, we shouldn't have a span consuming API because it gives the wrong impression to our callers.
You could argue that if you basically construct separate strings out of the thing you're passing in, then by allowing the caller to pass in a span, you at least avoid the yet another allocation to just represent the thing that is going to be split. Right? So in that sense, yes, you're not zero allocating, but you would be allocating less.
I think that distinction's probably a bit too subtle.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying, like, if the goal is better perf, right? You could argue that still better than than nothing, right? But yeah, I don't feel strongly one way or the other.
Well, there is already, I guess, on the counterexample, if you do want to accept spans as your input, there are already public APIs such as activity trace ID.create from string. And you could call those yourself and then pass it into the constructor here.
Yeah, so Tarek, the other thing I'm not entirely sure is like, what does this thing do that you can't already do? Isn't this basically just the thing that actually does encapsulate the W3 CID parsing?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Sorry.
So the try parse method that you're proposing here,
Mm-hmm.
is this just a convenience thing about things you already have, or is this actually the workhorse that does the W3 CID parsing?
Yeah, it does W3 CID parsing.
Yeah, so that means the existing APIs that Levi was mentioning, you would basically have to re-implement the W3 CID parsing to use them, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that would not be the recommended workaround then.
No, I mean, like, nobody will do parsing themselves. I mean, if we provided this API.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, like, imagine like you are getting like HTTP response. I mean, like, and in the header you have this string WC CID, and you want to create the activity context from it. So you passing to this API, and you will get the object, and that's it. So we are doing the parsing ourselves, not the caller doing any other way. I mean, any other parsing.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Should the parameter name be trace parent? Like with W3CID looks strange next to trace state. That's from the RFC. So why don't we use the trace parent? That's from the same RFC.
I think this makes sense to have it trace parent. I'm looking to the W3C now. I mean, to see the names. Yeah. Yeah, the W3C is using trace parent and trace state, I believe. Yeah.
So is there any other parsing you want to do for activity context, or is the W3 CID the only thing you would ever want to parse?
Yeah, this is the only thing. I mean, so activity context doesn't have anything else. I mean, like, more than just the parts of the W3C trace parent.
Yeah, and I don't just mean now. I mean, like, are you sure that you never ever find yourself and there's another W3C standard that you want to parse from?
It's unlikely.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is a version in this trace parent thing. So if it changes, we can have another internal parsing for the next version of the standard.
Yeah, that works.
By the way, I'm looking at the sources of activity context, and it doesn't seem to be storing strings.
It stores the trace ID. I mean, okay. It store activity trace ID, and store activity trace ID is just a struct around the string. I can point you to this quickly.
I believe you. Don't worry about it. No, as Imo was saying, I mean, it probably is a new allocated string because it's a subsection of the whole thing that you pass in. But I mean, I was just wondering, like, what is our guidelines in general? Because it's not only about the span. The moment you have the span parsing APIs, I thought we have a new pattern that tells you how many characters were successfully parsed. So you can kind of like, receive this data in some kind of buffer and keep parsing and advancing forward. I have to say, I'm not sure whether that's the pattern that we use everywhere, or we just used it for, the new UTF-8 parser.
Yeah, to be honest, I've never seen that pattern used outside of UTF-8 parser, but UTF-8 parser is meant for kind of a unique scenario where you're reading like a protocol or things coming in from the wire, whereas with this, you would expect it to be potentially delimited somehow where you would already know, here's the exact chunk that I want you to parse. So if parsing succeeds, it by definition consumed everything.
But you see, if it's delimited and it's not handling, it doesn't stop at some point, then you have the problem that you're getting a buffer with delimiters. Now you have to chop them into strings, which cause lots of allocations potentially, and then you pass it to this method, and it chops it even more into the ID and the constituents of the whole type.
Yes, but I don't think any of our other try-parse static methods on these types follow that pattern, though. If we wanted something like that, then we could probably do it on UTF-8 reader or UTF-8 parser, since that's where all of the other similar APIs are.
Yeah. So maybe the high-level question is it even important here? Like, how often does this parse method get called?
Yeah, it's very important for OpenTelemetry scenarios. This is why they raised this concern. And the guys from the OpenTelemetry side, they said that for them it's kind of like adaption blocker for them.
Well, it's not how important it is. How often is it called? Is it on a hot path?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if yes, then I would say we should think how we make the parsing efficient, and those, string-based parse methods are usually not.
But the way this method would be consumed is like by passing the value of a header into it. And outside of the very prototypey high-performance web servers, most of them just give you a string as the header value. So while you're right that we should think about it, I would say the most common use case just doesn't allow us to give the value in the span form.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. I know that David is trying to push the networking team to give access to headers in a more efficient way, but I guess when we have that, we can add the method, correct? Like we basically can add a static alternative that takes, the actual buffer, tells you how much it consumed, and optimize it.
Oh yeah, and things like that we'd probably want to take like sequence reader anyway, not just span. But yeah, we could add that in the future.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Cool. Anything else about the API?
Did we say earlier that we did not want a parse method in addition to a try-parse method?
Jeremy is usually very adamant that you should have a non-try overload.
Yeah, I was called on that a few days ago on my team as well. I proposed that we only have try parse, and I was told that design guidelines say that you have to have both.
Yeah, or just if you're going to do parsing, have a constructor overload as well.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, the constructor would make sense. And the constructor, of course, I mean, it will throw if we couldn't parse it, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but constructor, I think, is weird. Like, it's like, new int with string, right? Like, we could have done that, but that would have been very weird.
We did it for things like GUID and datetime.
Well, also,
yeah, and it's weird.
my concern also with the constructor is people, I mean, like, if somebody see, like, the constructor is available, they can just use the constructors. And at that time, they can run into the problem of the parsing. I mean, throwing and this stuff. So It will be good. I mean, like, if we have just try parse only, I mean, like, it's telling people, like, this is the right way to do it.
But you see, I as I mentioned, on my team, there was a discussion about it, and somebody said, hey, Christoph, you're telling us all the time that we shouldn't be cherry picking guidelines, but rather if we disagree with the guideline, we should change it. So I would say the same here. If we think that it's okay to just have try parse methods, which, by the way, if we were starting from, kind of not having the guideline for a very long time, I do think that kind of the try parse methods are just better, and we should just have them only. But is that an official thing? We changing the guideline, or
I don't see us doing that. Like if if our developers were used to C-style programming where you have to check the error code every single API that you call, yes, we could get away with it. But our developers are used to like exception handling.
Yeah, I also tend to agree that the value of doing it 20 years after we started to do both of these methods is just probably net negative.
Yeah, so I will just vote for just to have try parse only here. I mean, I'm not seeing the value for the constructor.
It's
the value is consistency with everything else that we've shipped in last 20 years.
It makes it more usable, basically. Like I would imagine many callers probably can't recover from try parse returning false, and having a method that just aborts things by throwing an exception is very useful to our developer audience. But I'm not suggesting adding a constructor, I'm just suggesting adding a parse method in addition to try parse, just like we have on int and GUID and everything else.
Oh, David just joined the chat and is saying make sure that it's fast. David, the answer is make sure that retrieving header values is fast first.
Did you know that having a parse method is actually faster than having a try parse method?
I think we should have a parse method.
Yeah, I'm not sure about like, just to be consistent, I mean like it's more than, I mean like it's better for people to use try parse all the time. I mean, from my point of view, is like if anybody using parse is, for my point of view, is wrong. I mean,
what would their else code look like? So say the try parse returns false. What would their else code look like?
Yeah, they can do something else. I mean, like, you know, use default context. I mean, there is no context, there is no parent ID and continuous operation.
Well, do we anticipate that most of them actually would have a fallback, or that they would just have if not try parse throw?
I don't think anybody will throw if try parse failed. I mean, they should continue the tracing. I mean, like, why they throw?
So that, to me, what that sounds like is we actually want an API then that doesn't return. Well, so what would they do? They would new up a default activity context and then just use that?
Yeah.
So it sounds like in that case, we actually, for the common user, don't want a method that returns true or false at all. We want a method that returns a real or fake activity context, right?
Yeah, but at least, I mean, they should know about, like, if we just return fake one or real one. Right?
So how
we cannot
give
take that decision on behalf of them. I mean, like, you know, we give them the information and they can decide what to do.
Tarek, are you arguing that we violate our guideline or that we change our guideline?
I'm saying, like, the guidelines is not applying here. It doesn't matter. I mean, like, maybe the guideline is good for in generic case, but for this case, I don't think it's reasonable here.
Okay, so yeah, a guideline is not a death pact, right? It's you know, something that's supposed to influence our decisions for this. If you know, if the designer of this API is telling us that it's realistic to expect people have a fallback rather than just expecting an exception, then I would consider that a valid exceptional case.
Yeah, I mean, like, if everyone feels strong about it, I don't mind, I mean, adding the parse, but but I'm not seeing it's really needed here. But...
I think, so Tarek, I would argue that locally, if you look just at this API, you could argue that it's better without parse. And my argument is actually not about, you know, Levi is saying that there are these scenarios and it's more usable. I actually don't even think about this. I think in the context of the whole platform, we taught our customers that they can always rely on finding both methods. And suddenly we would have some APIs. We would start, APIs would start creeping in that don't have both methods. I think the net value, the negative is for the whole platform, not for this API. So yes, we are making your API worse so that the platform can be better.
The flip side to that is we don't want to introduce an API that people naturally gravitate toward if it's the wrong thing for their scenario.
I would say we already have so many of those that you're not fixing. Basically, we already get minus 10 points because of the issue that you mentioned, correct? There are some APIs and there are parse methods and people should not be calling them.
No, but I disagree with the last thing you just said. Like if parse methods exist because people have reasons to call them. Like people sometimes can't recover from int.parse failing.
Yeah, but I thought you were saying that in this particular case, the issue is that there's this method and people shouldn't be calling them. I thought that's what you said.
Well, I mean,
no. Sorry, go ahead, Emo.
I mean, I think so. If we ever fix the networking stack to actually give you headers in a faster way, then I'm still somewhat skeptical that we would push people to call plumbing APIs to do that. I think it's more likely we would offer an API like, get activity context from HTTP context or something, and then that thing fishes out the headers in some efficient way, right? I don't think we want mainland people who just do tracing to manually construct these things, right? I mean, probably you want to just have a one-line method that gets you the activity context, and if that uses spans, great. But
sure.
I don't think we would push people towards that. So in that sense, I don't think that, the parse method that takes a string would lead people down the wrong way, or try parse for that matter.
So it sounds like, Emo, you were suggesting, same as Christoph was, same as I was earlier, having the parse method for consistency.
Yeah, I would leave the parse method for consistency, and then I think if we ever do the optimized span thing, then I'm pretty sure we want to have a one-liner that does that, and probably that would take into context or something.
Okay, sounds good to me.
Yeah, I can't fault that logic.
All right, so then anything else about this? Did David say anything more in chat?
We're lamenting that string segment isn't a thing.
I think I've heard
so
that before.
Another thing that came up earlier, the term W3C ID, I didn't see that term used in any other public API. Is it used anywhere else in a public API?
No, I mean, so Pavel just suggested to rename this to transparent.
Okay, great.
Or something like this. I mean, like.
Great.
Yeah, I'm just double checking about the name in the W3C itself. Yeah, transparent. Yeah, they use transparent and trace state.
Sure.
I mean, is this API, is activity context explicitly a W3C activity? Like, is it implied in the name that is a W3C trace parent?
Yeah, the intention of it is for W3C, yes.
Okay.
One more question about the trace state parameter, since it's nullable.
Yes.
Should it be defaulted in the parse method?
No, I mean, it's allowed to have nulls. I mean, like, it's allowed.
That's what I'm saying. But should it be defaulted to null?
How you default it in the pattern of try parse?
No, just the parse.
For the parse, it makes sense to default it to null. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's right. I hope we can do it for try parse too, but we could.
Yeah.
I mean, we can. It's just somewhat ugly to call.
You switch the parameters, you mean?
Yes, that's what you would have to do.
Yeah, that has a different sets of problems. I would just do it for, basically, the parse method is for convenience. And the moment you call try parse, well, then, it's not a big deal for you to pass no if you want.
Yes.
All right, so then I guess we would change this guy here to say this would be null, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess for the most common case, that's probably fine. I mean, if we really care, we could have an overload of try parse that doesn't take trace state, but I mean, I'm not sure how much we care.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't mind, to have this overload too. I mean, like...
Do people feel strongly that we should have it or that we shouldn't have it?
Is it going to be
yeah, I mean, like...
often?
Yeah, I mean, like, I can see in some scenarios, like, people don't have the trace state or... Yeah. They just need to parse the trace parent, and that's...
But is it true? Like, the spec almost always talks about propagating both values along. So, like, scenario where you only have trace parent, or you forgot to parse the trace state header, would be rare. Like, maybe we shouldn't have the overload so people remember to parse both all the time. And like, if they really, really don't have the trace state, then they can always pass now.
Yeah, I would say like if it's very common practice to not have it, then I think it makes sense. If the common practice is you always have one, I would agree with you. So to me, it's kind of like the, if it's very common, then I wouldn't have it.
Yeah, I don't think it would be common, but...
Then I would not do it. I mean, that kind of questions the wisdom of...
Got rid of the wrong overload.
Great. That kind of also, I guess, raises the point of like, should we make this actual optional on the other one as well?
I mean, if the great majority of cases you would have a state, then to me it makes sense for that to not be defaulted.
Yeah. I mean, the only benefit of defaulting is that you kind of know that it's okay to not pass in a value. I mean, the nullability kind of hints at that, but the vast majority of people still don't do nullable, so they probably don't realize that this is not something you need to pass in, but I think I'm okay with that. All right, anything else?
No, thank you.
Sweet. So that means we have 23 minutes left for other stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah, I need to run, guys, too, because I'm so swamped.
That is
Talk
totally
to you
fine.
later.
Sounds
Bye-bye.
good. Let me just open random stuff here. Like I invited Miriam for tomorrow, so I would skip this one. So this one should be relatively straightforward. So the one thing that we talked about was for Windows-specific APIs, the plan was that we will mark them as Windows 7.0. The reasoning being that that's the minimum we support, and instead of us chasing down which APIs were actually implemented when, we just use the lower bound. And then Eric Erhard pointed out that that's actually not super useful because first of all, that also now means that if I check for the API, I kind of have to check for the version number, which you could argue, yeah, that's consistency. But then the other problem is you already have existing code that does basically what we told people to, which is runtime information.is platform, os-platform.windows. And given that this doesn't include a version number, like we would always flag these calls now. And so if we were to just mark it with Windows, we can actually get away with fairly reasonable semantics by saying if you don't say a version number, you basically mean 0.0. And if you do an OS platform check, it basically means you're asserting a minimum version of 0.0, which now means that in combination, if we just mark the Windows-specific APIs with Windows without version number, all these checks now suddenly don't cause any noise in your code. They all are considered now basically correct code. And that's not necessarily a practice I would recommend for every Windows-specific API. I would just say we only do it for APIs that are basically supported by all versions of .NET Core. If we add new APIs that are requiring a higher version of Windows, like Windows 8, 8.1, or 10 or something, we would still annotate them with those version numbers. But for things where we really don't expect people to run environments that don't have them, it seems kind of pointless.
That makes sense. Is there anything, do we have any Linux or Mac APIs that fall under the same category?
Probably, although we don't. I mean, Linux is kind of a sad example in that world, because we don't have many Linux-specific APIs today, right? The only thing that I know of is if you will squint OpenSSL, and that might be similar, yes. For iOS and Android, you could say that, given that we will not support iOS 4 or something, right, that anything that's older than a certain iOS version, we could also attribute without a version number. But you also don't gain anything by that, because if you're actually building an iOS or an Android app, then you always have a minimum platform version anyway, right? So like if you're building for iOS, you can't build for iOS 0.0, right? You always build for iOS 10 or 11 or 12, right? And so everything that is lower than that will also, already suppress the analyzer. The reason Windows is different here is because we have Windows-specific APIs in the otherwise cross-platform base layer, right? So registry and ECL APIs are available when you just build for Net 5. And so if you just build for Net 5, there is no minimum version number, right? And so we would now say everything that's Windows-specific, you have to actually have a version check. Versus if you build a WPF or WinForms app, same reasoning would apply, right? If you build a WinForms or WPF app, we know your minimum platform is Windows.7. So if an API requires Windows.7, well, then we would never ask you to do a check. But if the API now requires 8.1 or 10, well, then we would ask you to do a version check as well. And so in that sense, Windows is the only special one because it's in the cross-platform layer. And everything else we kind of have, put on top of that. Linux is the only one where that might happen, but like for Linux, we're also in this position where version numbers are generally not something that makes a lot of sense. So I guess, I can totally see an API being Linux specific, but what it really means is any version of Linux.
What if you were building a library that was supposed to be cross-platform, like be able to be used both in Windows, iOS, and Android, and you wanted to make an iOS specific call?
You fundamentally cannot.
Really?
Yeah, because we don't expose the iOS bindings in the Net 5 TFM. You would have to
those are the official bindings. You can always bind yourself.
Sure. I mean, if you're willing to do that yourself, yes, then in that sense, you can do the same thing you can do on Windows, right? You just have a pinvoke. In which case...
But the APIs just won't be there. You would have to cross-compile your library.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by the API, right? I mean, like, you cannot expose any iOS-specific APIs in the sense that you can't use the official bindings, because we don't give you the official bindings in the Net 5 TFM, right? But you can have your own types that you use to, p-invoke and marshal, if that's what you can do. In the same way that if I have a p-invoke, I can define my own classes and structs that are then either marshal over or copied to some private things that are being marshaled, right? And then what you can do is you can, of course, mark your own API as, this API requires iOS, so you can just forward the version check to your customers, or you can do it for your customers if you abstract it away somehow.
Right, the abstracted away is like the case that I was thinking. If it was, here's the general method that you want to provide in your library that anybody can call,
right? And
then you do, if runtime information is on Windows, then do the Windows specific call. If runtime information is on iOS, do the iOS specific call.
Right.
You're saying you can't do that.
Well, I'm saying
you'd have to do if.
So in principle, you can do that, right? So the analyzer and the platform check mechanics that we have in the platform would support that. The challenge is that we don't give you bindings against 5.0. And so the only reason why we have bindings for Windows in 5.0 is because this Windows TFM thing didn't exist back then, right? So like everything that is Windows specific also happens to be in the cross-platform TFM already, but we not all of it, by the way, not WinForms, not WPF, right? But because with 5.0 we said WPF and WinForms will only be in Net 5-Windows either. So if you want to call those APIs, you have to actually cross-compile as well. And the cross-compilation would be the canonical way how you would abstract it. You would give your customers a public void, do something, and then you would say pound if this, do that, pound if that, do that, right? you wouldn't do runtime checks for that.
Do we have plans to better improve the production of cross-compiled NuGet packages and other bits?
When you say improve the production, what specific part do you have in mind?
The general process of cross-compiling and producing NuGet packages automatically isn't great.
Well, that's what I'm asking, because I've done it multiple times. It has limitations, but it is generally working reasonably well. We don't have support for RIDs really in the toolchain anywhere, unless you are, having access to Eric and you can directly ask him what to do. But that one is not going to change anytime soon, and we also don't have, the typical VS problems of, that the cross compilation is not fully plumbed through the UI experience. But building a NuGet package that is cross compiled is literally a checkbox in VS at this point. You just have to deal with the fact that you're cross-compiling, and that comes with some, bumps in the experience. And yes, there's not much that we will do to change that in the 5.0 timeframe. So what I'm hearing is people are generally supportive of this then. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes.
So as we move forward in time and we drop Win 7 support and Mac and iOS end up dropping their legacy versions,
right,
will we conceptually be okay with going and changing existing version checks? Like, let's say in 3 years when Windows 7 is fully not supported anywhere, even with paid support or whatever.
Right.
Are we conceptually okay with going and changing existing APIs that say like min version Win 10 and just changing those to be no version?
We could. The general thing is here, I think there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. I don't think it's a breaking change. It's just work we would have to do. I would just question the value that you provide, because presumably if people targeted these operating systems already with .NET 5, they would have to have version checks in them today. And so you basically now say, well, if you were to target, if you were to write a brand new project, then the benefit of these, simplified bindings would now be that you don't have to do version checks. You just get away with the platform check. But then the question really is how much of this existing code would actually benefit from that, and there probably wouldn't be much, if any, right?
I imagine
not existing code, it's new code.
Yeah, it would just be net new code, right? And maybe that is big enough as a value, but
I imagine the two things are, one, net new code, and two, notifying users that, hey, this code is effectively dead now on .NET 7. And so you're actually, you have this code, you have this additional maintenance cost that you really don't need anymore, because you'll never be able to run on that platform because we just don't support it anymore.
Right.
So I think there's benefit both to new code, which allows you to write simpler code from the get-go, and also existing code where you're able to identify code that you don't need. Like Win 10 has a newer version of libgdi as a baseline. And so you could say you don't need to check for libgdi 6 anymore because you can assume 6.1 is there.
Yeah, basically what you're asking is the inverse analyzer, right? That basically says if you're running under a guard clause, is any of the APIs you're calling actually requesting the API version you're checking for, which we don't have today. But that's kind of what you would have to do to actually let people know that, oh, by the way, you're checking for version number, that you don't have to anymore. Otherwise, you don't benefit from this, right? Otherwise, it would literally just only be for new code.
Well, there definitely is a benefit to making new code easier, right? Like one of the things that we've been lamenting for 20 years is, why are we paying now for the sins from the late 90s? But I think the analyzer that you and Tanner were just talking about, off by default, is useful just from the general category of, hey, here's 10 lines of code that you can shrink down to 2, right? Like more of a modern paradigm type analyzer. I don't know if we have a category for that right now.
I don't even think it needs to be off by default. It would. You just have to make sure that it doesn't have false positives, right? But if it kind of works the way I described, it seems generally desirable, right? Because it probably means you emitted. If you just do normal development, right? You call some APIs, we warn you, start guarding the calls, you refactor your code, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, you call a different API that requires a minimum, only a smaller version of Windows, well, you now accidentally like require a higher version of Windows, right? That's like even without us changing the platform versioning, that still seems beneficial to make sure that your code is actually checking what it should and not more and not less. But yeah, it seems like the only concern I have is cost to the analyzer, because it's already not super cheap to run. And so the question is whether we can do this cheaply without making it super expensive in the common case, but I'm pretty sure we can.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if that analyzer by itself would be all that useful, but it came with a bunch of other, if it came with a bunch of other here's how to modernize your code analyzers, then I think it has utility.
Right.
But I wouldn't let that stop us from doing this, though. And I would still be a fan of what Tanner had suggested regarding, like, once 7.0 goes out of support, then we start rebaselining stuff.
Do we have any APIs that are marked minimum OS platform Windows higher than 7, like today 8 or 10?
No, but today we don't have any of them. Today, literally everything we have is Win 7.
We have internal checks, which, at least within CoreLib or the framework itself, might be beneficial to have these for our own purposes, and some of those are Win 10 specific, such as in WinGDI. Or libGDI.
Yeah, and ASP.NET does some get proc address hijinks to figure out what capabilities your OS supports, and they'll call enlightened APIs if they're there.
But if we don't have any public APIs that have Windows 8 or Windows 10, then we shouldn't have to worry about when Windows 7 goes out of support to change any of them.
Well, we don't have any today. And I think the general concept is, if we are exposing stuff that's Win 7 specific today, Win 10 has added, a slew of new APIs that we may eventually take a dependency on.
Take a dependency on is one thing. Expose the API is another thing, right? Like, your concern's only valid if we have an API that says this is supported OS platform Windows 8, and then 7 goes out of support, and now we move all those Windows 8 ones to Windows everything.
Right, but we're still going to provide guidance for other libraries and stuff as well, I would presume.
Okay.
I think in general, the framework doesn't expose very many OS-specific APIs. Although Xamarin and Xamarin Essentials might and Maui might, with them actually exposing UI-specific stuff.
I mean, Xamarin Essentials generally doesn't. They do capability APIs now for this stuff, but like the idea is that they're basically cross-platform, similar to what we have in the BCL, right? The only thing is, I asked this to the WinForms guys, like, because they added new APIs for some stuff that Vista added, and I said, like, is there anything that you added that isn't in Win 7? The answer was no. And I think, like, if they would start to add some things, like, I don't know, Windows 10 added some shelf feature, and then they start adding those concepts to WinForms or WPF, then we may have the exact same situation. We would say, yep, there's a new property on form or whatever, and that would be, supported OS platform Windows 10 point something, right? And then the experience will be very similar. It will be a bit more tricky there if you consider the designer, because you don't actually write the code yourself. So flagging designer-generated code might not be what we want, but I guess that's a problem we can tackle when they actually do that. But yeah, I'm not aware of any features that we have in the platform where we would expect the callers to guard the call. We generally abstract that.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is that I know that ASP.NET, like WebSockets on IIS, for instance, they do have to have some OS guards there, but they don't expose their own public APIs using these attributes. Instead, they use a They use like an iFeature interface type thing, and then you would detect the presence of that. So they have a different way of solving this in general. But had they not had that, this would be a mechanism they would use, I would imagine.
Yep.
Actually, I think we do have an API that doesn't work on Win 7 in .NET 5 for TLS 1.3.
Are we attributing that correctly?
I don't know. We'll have to find out.
Yeah, so let me mark
Also, this doesn't seem to, the API doesn't seem to handle things like OpenSSL version.
So when you say the API, what do you mean?
This supported OS platform. Like, if I'm depending on a specific version of OpenSSL or ICU or something for an API, would this allow me to communicate that? Because it seems like it's only looking at OS level and not other dependencies.
Yes, you can't. Yeah, you can't say like this is conditioned on some other thing. You can only talk about a particular OS because that's the only thing we realistically can do any static checking for.
Right.
But I mean, you could imagine that we map this, right? Like you could say that we know that OpenSSL version X is supported on these platforms, and then we can transcode this into that means these platforms are supported, right? But that's probably problematic because OpenSSL is a moving target as well, right? And they may add new support for operating systems, older or newer for that matter. So that might be hard.
Right.
I mean, I would generally say the way I see this is like there's kind of two kinds of APIs then, right? There's the actual, cross-platform API that we provide, and then we are on the hook to make whatever crazy gymnastics we have to do to make it work across the variety of operating systems and dependencies. And then there is OS-specific functionality, right? And for the latter, I mean, there's like, high-level things like OS bindings that we generate nicely, and then there is the, here's particular integration points that we provide that, like OpenSSL or WMI or something like this, and then we would try to make that work across a certain set of operating systems that we happen to support, right? And so in that sense, we get to say what we support, right? If there's a newer version of OpenSSL that supports Windows Vista for whatever reason, but we didn't build it this way, we only built the dependency for Windows 7, then that's fine, right? Like that doesn't necessarily conflict with that. Because for the most part, we would have to package them up anyway, right? And like have to compile them and have the right OS support in the package and stuff like that. All right, I think we are now kind of out of time for anything else. I mean, maybe this one here, that should not be super controversial because we just talked about it. So when I proposed a set of Windows-specific APIs, Jeremy mentioned that OpenSSL should be marked as not supported on Windows, which back then we didn't have an actual way to do this. And now we actually have that. It's the unsupported OS platform attribute, and we would basically, I propose we would mark the whole assembly like this, saying, yeah, there's no version of Windows that supports it. Jeremy hinted at the fact that we may be able to support it in the future based on some work that Windows might be doing. And then we would just, add another attribute to that, which would be supported OS platform Windows X.Y. And that would basically indicate that, OpenSSL is not supported on Windows unless you're on this version or higher.
So I did comment on that offline, I think, to some people. When Windows is moving to a model where things are provisioned via the store rather than in any given version of the operating system. So the idea is, let's say that the version of Windows that comes out next year might have support for OpenSSL, but you would still have to acquire an enablement package through the store. So now you have a philosophical question: is a version check sufficient, or do you also need to perform a capability check?
Well, I mean, I would say no. I would say, we can look up what OS versions that store package provides support for, which clearly wouldn't be Win 7, right? Because the store is effectively at least 8.0, right? but probably would probably be 10 point something would be my guess. And so we would just say, yeah, the minimum is 10 point something, and then you may still have to acquire that, right? In the same way that, if you're running on a Windows server, you may have to enable long path support or something that we can detect and tell you in an exception message, but we wouldn't be able to do this statically. And so I think that's the way we would do it. I mean, the minimum we would just fail at runtime with an actionable error that says, sorry, you didn't actually acquire the package, please download that from the store. Or we would just tell people like, sorry, we can't do this. Or we basically just say, okay, maybe there is an actual way, if this is popular enough, that we can put an attribute on the method that says require store package XYZ. And then if we are fancy, we aggregate all call sites you have, generate you a manifest that says your app that you just built requires these 4 store packages to be on your box, right? And that becomes ever an issue. But I don't think you could do a dynamic check, because how would you do a check on whether your deployed environment has the package installed at build time? Like that would not be possible, right?
Well, that's the thing. Like I'm wondering if, scenario-wise, if I wanted to call into OpenSSL, I'm trying to figure out what reliable mechanism I would actually be able to use to figure out if I can do it. And what I was arguing is I don't think an OS version check is sufficient.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. I think it would be, right? Because you would basically say, if whatever the package is that goes into the store, we'll have a minimum OS version that this package runs on, right? And that will be the version I would put here. And then there is these orthogonal thing of like, yeah, by the way, you have to install the store package to use OpenSSL, and that we can't express unless we do work, right? I mean, in concept, I don't think it would be wrong to have an attribute that marks as APIs and says, requires external dependency, right? And then some representation of what that is. In the same way, you could say we could mark we could mark the, let's say that we support it on Linux, but we require some apt-get package, right? We could do the same thing there and say, there's an apt-get dependency now that you have to pull in.
Right, and now I would need to guard the call site with if OS is supported and has package installed, right?
Well, yeah, if you want to guard for that, I guess, yes.
But now why do I have if A and B guarding the call site if instead of just having if B? Because if B is always going to give me the correct answer. Why am I even performing an OS version check?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. So you could argue that we don't burn in this thing at all. We just basically just say, sorry, this is information we can't express statically unless we invent an attribute to do that. Yeah.
Right. I guess I didn't want to have to have somebody guard it with this and guard it with an additional check when the additional check by itself would have been sufficient. Then this check just becomes noise.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If that is the thing, I guess. So let's say we ship now with unsupported OS platform Windows, and then in the .NET 6 timeframe, what you described happened. At that point, I would just strip the attribute. I would just say, sorry, there's no platform check you can do. The check you are supposed to write is this. And then if we really feel fancy enough, we would write a one-off analyzer for that. Or we would generalize it. I mean, that's basically the two directions I can go in.
Yeah, and by the way, just to clarify, I have no knowledge whatsoever of the OS team actually going to do this. It's just this is the direction they're heading with a few other things. So we need to be prepared for how we want to deal with a world where this does come to fruition.
Right.
And removing the attribute entirely might be the right way to do it.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, as is here seems fine. With the knowledge that in the future we might have to remove it.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
While Immo's typing that, I had a super quick question on one of the APIs we reviewed Tuesday. For single and double two-string that accepts the int precision, we didn't specify whether or not we would also expose the overload that takes culture.
This was for float and double?
Yeah. We said we'd expose the new overload that takes char format int precision. We didn't say if we would also expose one that takes the culture. That way you can, for example, explicitly say invariant.
Yeah, it normally is best practice that you would pass invariant into these APIs.
Right, and so if we want people to support cultures in the future, we need to have an overload that takes it. Otherwise, it's a breaking change because the default behaviors normally pass in current if none is specified.
Which issue is that you're talking about?
30657.
Yeah, I think the rationale was that this is used for debugging, right? So do we actually care that you can specify a culture? I mean, I'm not opposed to, but like,
I'm sure some people who prefer to see numbers in their native format do care.
Yeah.
Especially for
serializers
debugging.
might use this too.
I mean, that would be the default anyway, right?
No, the default is typically current culture, not invariant.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, like the default would be you would see it in your native representation, not whatever invariant is, which is probably what most people would like to see.
Right, except for the people who want to see it as invariant.
And that would be serializers.
Which we don't want to support, right? I mean, I thought the whole point was that we only do this for debugging purposes.
Most people will probably use it for debugging, but there's likely other scenarios where it's useful as well, was the general thing. And so the question I had was, should we either have it take iFormat provider equals null, or have the other overload that takes it explicitly?
I mean, generally, I would say we should match whatever the type already does. And I think the other two string ones are most likely taking them as overloads, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would do that probably.
Okay.
Yeah, the concern I have generally with like optional is like if the existing method group is not designed for optionals, then you don't want to end up in a situation where you no longer can add overloads because of ambiguity. Yeah. All right, so then. This is marked as API approved. Okay, let's try something. I'm not sure my tool will pick this up, but I can try. Let's do this. Let's change it back to approved to just trick my tool and then see whether that actually works.
Need to figure out if your tool will react to us flagging things as approved as well.
It was suggest, yeah, that should work. It was suggest to add. The question is just whether it becomes a no-op because they just happen in sequence, but I think it should handle it. It was.
You should put a question mark after format provider because it's nullable.
Oh, I see. All right. I think we're over time now, and then we can do the rest tomorrow.
Awesome. Is tomorrow a backlog day?
Well, tomorrow I have the other issues that I marked as blocking. So we have console logger.
Oh.
And then there's this one here that I hope I read enough details to actually talk about it. And then this one was basically a rename suggestion, yeah.
Great.
And then the rest would be backlog.
Perfect.
So if you have anything else, Tanner, like now is your time to mark things.
Yep.
All
I'm
right.
going through my issues very slowly, but about half of this page is mine anyways, so
You're welcome.
All marked and stuff is ready for review too, just for fun.
Yeah, don't do that.
And then we can spend an entire month talking about UTF-8 string.
You know how to make my day, Levi.
I do. Have you grabbed your pitchforks yet?
No, but I will grab your pitchforks. All right.
You all have a good day.
You too. Bye bye.